Hey YouTube, I am here to record kind of a video response to a podcast episode that aired recently on Invisbilia about empathy. Before I get into that, just a couple of meta notes. One, no, I did not get punched in the face. Apparently I'm not that great at falling when it comes to rock climbing, so I clocked myself in my own face with my knee. So if you're concerned, I'm fine. It's just sometimes adventures happen. So for the next couple of videos, I'm gonna have what looks like a left eye. The other thing is I have allergies really bad. Apparently Maryland is like the worst, or one of the worst states in the country for allergies. So apologies if I sound weird, I have to reach for tea. That is just where we are this spring. Okay, that out of the way. So what is this video about? So there was this episode of Invisbilia, which is an NPR podcast, recently where they were talking about empathy, and kind of as like a meta topic, they used this example of this guy who frankly is horrible towards women, identifies as an incel, and they used two versions of a story about him from two different journalists' perspectives to kind of get to the a question of whether empathy is like a universal good. Should you always be empathetic, or should you usually be empathetic? Is empathy as a journalist always a good point, starting point to take? And I think it was Hana Rosen, but I'm not totally sure, so I'm just gonna be vague and not use names. One of the hosts of the show, who I believe is Gen X, kind of talked about it as a generational thing, and the idea that empathy, to her generation, that they were taught to be empathetic to everyone. That part of it was like World War II, and that not having empathy is how we got there, like blah blah blah. But the basic idea being that she sees as a generational value, having empathy for people that you disagree with or that you wouldn't normally feel positive feelings towards. And then there's this younger journalist who is coming in, and like, look, sometimes you shouldn't have empathy. Sometimes actually recording a story in such a way that is encouraging your audience to feel empathy for somebody like this guy who is terrible towards women, is not actually like a positive thing. And I have to admit that listening to this, especially listening to the older host perspective, was like, it was really giving me the heebie-jeebies. It just, like, it didn't feel good. And I thought it would be interesting to talk about on this channel, in part because I talk about spiritual things, and I think that empathy and personal development, and I think that empathy is very much a part of that, and that this is an interesting question, is like, is there a line when it comes to empathy? And I don't come down 100% on either side, but I'm a little more towards the more selective empathy side, which maybe is generational, or maybe I don't tend to buy into like, oh, this is a generation thing. We all have our own perspectives, but my generation might inform me. I am a millennial, kind of on the older end of millennial, but still a millennial. And so I feel like there's a difference between, well, one, I think that there's a key difference, and they get into this some of the episode, but I think there is a key difference between empathizing with someone who is marginalized in some way and empathizing with somebody who is an oppressor, and specifically someone who is oppressing your group. Expecting someone to be empathetic towards an oppressor, or expecting someone to be empathetic towards someone like, towards someone in relation to the oppressive thing they're doing. So for example, with this guy in the episode, trying to get the audience to empathize with his position towards women. I think that's very different from trying to get somebody to empathize with something they don't understand, and particularly a marginalized group that they don't understand. And even if we're talking about people who are generally in a position of privilege, like I can think of an example where I might not have a lot of empathy naturally towards someone who is, let's say, is a white person who has conservative values and is at the lower end of the class spectrum, and maybe some of their conservative values make me go, oh, I don't really want to empathize with you. I can see situations in which it might benefit me and I should really have some empathy towards their story, towards their background, because being like a middle class person in an urban environment, you know, somebody who is at a poverty level in a rural environment, I'm not going to totally understand their experience, and I think I should have empathy towards them when thinking about their story as a whole. But that doesn't mean that I have to empathize towards a particular opinion that they might have against gay people or an anti-feminist opinion. I think I should be open and not assume that they have those opinions before they've actually stated them. But if they state them, I don't think that empathy requires me to be like, oh, well, it's just their background. You know, it's the kind of thing where you say, like, sometimes with older people, like, it's okay if they're homophobic, they're just old. Like, I don't think that's true. I've actually met a lot of people who are super queer inclusive who are old, and also gay people are not a new thing. So, like, I'm very resistant towards that kind of thing. I think it's also that empathy is like a mutual thing. It is a multi-directional street. And so, like, if I think about the concept of restorative justice and how restorative justice works, a big part of the practice of restorative justice is buy-in from all sides, is everyone participating in the process. And restorative justice, I think, involves having to have a certain level of empathy and an understanding of each other's humanity, even when one or more people in the situation have done a horrible thing. But a big part of that is the mutual commitment to the process. It's the fact that the aggressor or the oppressor is also participating fully in the process and is also engaging in empathy. And I think a lot of times when we're asked to have empathy in this way, where it's like, oh, like you're creating a bubble, like you don't understand other people, we're asked to have empathy for folks who don't have empathy towards us. So a good example of this would be after the 2016 election, I got real annoyed when people were constantly saying, oh, it's because you're all in a bubble, you didn't see this coming, you know, liberals. The problem is that liberals don't interact with conservatives. And because of this, we didn't know that it was a threat. Okay, one, some of us knew it was a threat. And I would say, I think black folk were sitting here going, yeah, no, it was a threat all day long, right? So, I don't know if that's totally true. And then, the idea of bubble, it just really bothered me that it was like, it felt very victim blamey. It felt like it was like, oh, it's your fault, you know, for not engaging with people. It's not the fault of people who are voting for literal Nazis. So, like, there is a point at which empathy is not the answer, or a point at which I don't believe that the quote-unquote other side, and that's simplistic, but I don't believe the other side necessarily has empathy towards me. And there's a point at which you can say, no, for my self-care, for my boundaries, I am not going to have a whole lot of empathy in that direction. Or maybe I have a little bit of empathy, but, like, I don't need to spend all my empathy spoons. They talked in the episode, they had this concept, let me get it right, of reserving empathy, quote-unquote, for your own damn team. So the idea of, like, you know, empathy is important, but maybe you reserve your empathy for the people for whom it matters, basically. And I don't know that I'm 100% there. Like, I do think it's, you know, the example of, like, somebody in a poor white rural family, you know, for example, like, that might not be what I would necessarily automatically think of as my own damn team. But I do think you can reserve empathy, and it's healthy to reserve empathy for a limited number of situations, because you don't have an unlimited reserve of empathy available. I think what might be an even better way of thinking about it would be, I think you can empathize in a way that is consistent with your own values. So I think you could say, you know, because of my values, I don't empathize with racism. I'm not going to. And I'm not going to try to understand why. I'm not going to try to understand somebody's full context and background to understand why they're racist. I don't think that's useful. You know, for some people it might be a tool of anti-racism when working with people is to empathize with them. And I think to some degree, like, for example, if I'm doing anti-racist work with other white folk, I do use empathy, and I use relating to them to talk about my own journey, to talk about, I think it's really important in white anti-racism to talk about your own journey as a white person, your own racism, to do that. But in those contexts, like, I'm generally talking to somebody who at least is willing to, like, take a few steps to meet me, if not halfway, a little bit along the way, to have empathy for people of color, even if they're feeling kind of resistant and they're feeling like, I'm not a racist, and, like, that's where they're coming from. I have a little bit of empathy to start them along the way. I don't think that I have to empathize with somebody who's just virulently anti-racist and screaming about it. And I think I extra don't have to empathize as a trans person with people who are transphobic. Like, if it is my identity that they're, you know, an oppressor in the direction of my identity, I don't think I owe anyone any empathy in that zone. I think it's not so much about my own damn team, but it's about the fact that they're so... that position is so against my values, and that I can use my values as a measure, as like a metric on whether to engage and whether to feel like empathy is important in a certain way. That is why it is important for me to feel empathy towards those who are marginalized, and not as important to feel empathy with those who are oppressing. It's why, in the example in the Invisbilia episode, I think that I don't have a lot of empathy towards the guy they were interviewing, because, you know, my values in terms of respecting other people and in terms of, you know, behavior towards women is if somebody is terrified of you, you should not keep pushing. Like, consent is an important value of mine. And while I will help somebody and teach them consent to some degree, there's a point at which, no, I'm not going to sit here and listen to the story and then to this piece of journalism and then feel like a lot in my heart for this guy. I'm just not. So, yeah, I don't know. I'd be curious to hear folks' thoughts on this. You know, if you listened to the episode, what did you think? And even if not, just in general, like, where do you come down on this in terms of, like, how much empathy you should feel? And, you know, not that I'm really into politics on this channel, but, like, if you have thoughts about that idea of, like, that the bubbles make it more likely for a, you know, Nazi to get elected. Like, what do you think about that argument?